It was a day like any other in New York City. The sun gleamed brightly off the towering skyscrapers, and the rush of people seemed to hum through the streets, their lives unaffected by the shadows lurking in the corners of the world. But in a hidden corner of the city, something was about to unfold, something that would shake the very foundation of the public's trust in the medical system. A year before, in 2010, a new vaccine was rushed to market, hailed as the breakthrough that would prevent a devastating global pandemic. The government praised its quick approval, while pharmaceutical companies hailed it as a triumph of science. But what they didn't mention was the dark, secretive undertones of this so-called miracle cure. Beneath the surface, a sinister web of manipulation, greed, and negligence began to weave together in ways that no one could have anticipated. In early 2011, an anonymous whistleblower leaked confidential documents from one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, exposing a scandal that would forever alter the way the world viewed vaccines. The documents, now in the hands of investigative journalists, revealed shocking truths about the vaccine's approval process, truths that the public was never meant to know. The documents showed that the vaccine's trials were rushed, with data falsified and adverse reactions suppressed. Worse still, it was revealed that several members of the regulatory bodies responsible for ensuring the vaccine's safety had close ties to the very pharmaceutical companies they were supposed to monitor. There were rumors of covert meetings, bribes, and questionable deals made behind closed doors. The public health crisis that followed was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from symptoms that had never been part of the official list of side effects. Children, adults, and the elderly all experienced mysterious, severe reactions, some of which were fatal. And yet, despite the mounting evidence of harm, the pharmaceutical companies denied any wrongdoing, and the government remained silent. The media, for the most part, remained complicit. Mainstream outlets, once champions of public health, were now being paid off to bury the truth. The public, still clinging to the belief that vaccines were their safeguard against harm, was left in the dark. The vaccine became a symbol of betrayal, a glaring example of how Big Pharma had manipulated the system for profit, while thousands of lives were irreversibly damaged. But as the story unraveled, a new question emerged. Who was truly behind the vaccine scandal? Was it just about profit, or was there something deeper at play? Conspiracy theories began to swirl about hidden experiments, government cover-ups, and secret societies working in the shadows to control global health. In the heart of New York, an old building long abandoned by most housed the remnants of a conspiracy that had been in the making for decades. The files from the pharmaceutical company were now being studied by a small group of whistleblowers, each uncovering more horrifying details. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous their quest became. People who got too close to the truth had a way of disappearing. Those who seek the truth, one of the documents read, often pay a price they can't afford. The truth was out there, buried in the darkness, waiting to be uncovered. But in the world of power, influence, and money, could anyone ever really trust what they were told about their health? The scandal was only the beginning. In the early months of 2011, the world was reeling from the aftermath of the global vaccine rollout. The year before, a miracle drug had been hailed as the savior against a worldwide pandemic and infectious disease that had threatened to decimate entire populations. Governments and global health organizations stood proudly behind it, pushing for widespread distribution, urging citizens to line up and receive their shots. The vaccine was presented as the solution to an imminent crisis. Governments promised that it was the result of decades of research and billions of dollars in funding. They assured the public that its approval was rigorous, its testing thorough, and its side effects minimal, if any. The world bought in. Fear of the pandemic led people to place their trust in the very institutions that were meant to protect them. Yet, hidden beneath the surface of this carefully orchestrated campaign, things were not as they seemed. The first signs of trouble emerged when a small, Independent group of scientists began questioning the legitimacy of the trials. As whispers grew louder, the reality of the vaccine's true effects began to surface. It wasn't just the occasional adverse reaction, it was widespread, devastating, and to some, life-altering. The story behind the scandal was more than just one vaccine. It was about a system, a network of pharmaceutical giants, regulatory agencies, and political bodies that operated in the shadows. It was about greed, secrecy, and manipulation on a scale that most couldn't even comprehend. The vaccine, once hailed as the salvation of the world, had become a symbol of corporate deception and government failure. The story of the vaccine's rise to prominence begins not in the labs or research centers, but in the corridors of power where decisions about public health are made behind closed doors. In 2009, as the world braced for a potential pandemic, a group of powerful pharmaceutical executives and government officials came together with one goal: to create a vaccine that would protect millions, and in doing so, secure massive profits for their companies. What they didn't anticipate was the public outrage and devastation that would follow. The origins of the vaccine were shrouded in secrecy from the very beginning. Unlike typical vaccine development, which requires years of research and clinical trials, this new vaccine was fast-tracked under the guise of a public emergency. The company responsible for its production, Phoenix Pharmaceuticals, had a reputation for cutting corners and speeding up processes for maximum profitability. This particular vaccine was no different. Behind closed doors, Phoenix's executives worked hand in hand with key government health agencies, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and the World Health Organization, WHO, to ensure that their product would be approved without delay. But what the public didn't know was that there were significant discrepancies in the vaccine's trial data. Preliminary studies showed some concerning results, including severe allergic reactions in a small group of participants. These red flags were quietly swept under the rug. The true extent of the rushed process became apparent when the vaccine was released to the public in early 2010. Within months, reports of adverse reactions began to surface. Some patients experienced mild symptoms, such as fever and fatigue. However, a significant number of individuals, particularly children, began suffering from more serious conditions, neurological disorders, autoimmune reactions, and even fatalities. But the most disturbing part of the story wasn't just the health consequences. It was how Phoenix Pharmaceuticals and the government handled the situation. In the face of mounting evidence that the vaccine was causing harm, they chose to remain silent. Instead of issuing recalls or warning the public, they opted for damage control, downplaying the seriousness of the reactions and continuing to promote the vaccine as safe. The media, once a trusted source of information, became complicit in the cover-up. Major news outlets, many of whom were financially supported by pharmaceutical companies, kept the story under wraps. Investigative journalists who dared to ask tough questions were met with resistance. They were told to back off or risk losing access to important sources within the pharmaceutical industry. It wasn't long before whispers of bribery and payoffs began to surface. At the heart of the scandal was the issue of trust. People trusted the government to protect them, and they trusted the pharmaceutical companies to act in the best interest of public health. But instead, they were betrayed. Phoenix Pharmaceuticals had prioritized profits over safety, and the government had allowed it to happen. The damage was not just physical, but psychological. People who had lined up for their vaccinations felt betrayed, and many would never trust the medical establishment again. But this was just the beginning. As more documents came to light, it became clear that this wasn't the first time Big Pharma had put profit over public health. What had begun as a government and corporate cover-up of a single vaccine disaster was about to reveal a much larger, more terrifying truth. This was only one chapter in a long history of manipulation and deceit. And as the scandal grew, the question on everyone's mind was, how far would the conspiracy go? By mid-2011, the growing public unrest was impossible to ignore. The adverse reactions were no longer a whisper. They were a cacophony, a wave of personal tragedies that reached the ears of politicians, health officials, and the media. But for months, the stories were being buried. The global health authorities, led by the World Health Organization, WHO, stood firm in their defense of the vaccine, while governments around the world, especially in the United States, continued to encourage citizens to get vaccinated. However, amidst the chaos and confusion, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a whistleblower. Dr. Eleanor Graves, a former senior researcher at Phoenix Pharmaceuticals, had worked on the development of the vaccine in its earliest stages. She had always been a firm believer in the promise of medical science, driven by the idea that vaccines could save lives and eliminate deadly diseases. But as she worked on the vaccine trials, she began to notice unsettling patterns that were quickly becoming hard to ignore. Graves first suspected something was wrong when she found discrepancies in the trial data. The results didn't add up. Clinical trials that were supposed to include diverse groups of participants were being manipulated to exclude certain adverse outcomes. The vaccine's clinical trials showed no significant signs of adverse reactions in the majority of participants, but Graves discovered that many of the trial reports had been altered, data points selectively removed, and red flags omitted entirely. It was these inconsistencies that pushed Graves to investigate further. What she uncovered was a labyrinth of corporate deceit, regulatory failures, and hidden conflicts of interest. She found evidence that Phoenix Pharmaceuticals had not only rushed the vaccine to market, but had actively ignored and buried reports of severe reactions during the trial phases. Worse yet, she discovered that some of the researchers involved in the trials had been paid off by the company to downplay the risks and exaggerate the benefits. One particular finding disturbed her deeply: the relationship between key members of the regulatory bodies and the pharmaceutical executives. Graves discovered that several high-ranking officials at the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, had financial ties to Phoenix Pharmaceuticals. Some of these individuals had even received lucrative consulting fees from the company, while they were supposed to be overseeing its vaccine approval process. The more Graves delved into the evidence, the more she realized that the vaccine scandal was not a simple mistake or a matter of oversight. It was a calculated decision to prioritize profit over public health. The vaccine, with its high price tag and global distribution, was a cash cow for Phoenix Pharmaceuticals, and they were willing to go to any lengths to protect it. But Graves knew that if she didn't act, the damage would be irreversible. She began collecting evidence: emails, documents, internal memos, and secret recordings that showed the lengths the company had gone to in order to manipulate the vaccine's approval process. She had to be careful. If anyone found out what she was doing, the consequences could be catastrophic. But she felt an obligation to the public, to the people who had been lied to and harmed by the vaccine. In July 2011, Graves reached out to an investigative journalist, Richard Klein, who had previously covered health scandals in the past. She sent him the files, urging him to take a look. Klein was initially skeptical, but as he reviewed the documents, his skepticism quickly turned to disbelief. The evidence was overwhelming. The story, he realized, was bigger than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about a single vaccine. It was about a global conspiracy that involved the highest echelons of both government and corporate power. Klein and Graves worked together in secret, developing a plan to expose the truth. They knew the risks. They knew that the media would be against them, that the pharmaceutical companies would fight back with everything they had. But they were determined. The world needed to know what had happened, and they couldn't stop now. In August of 2011, Klein published his first article detailing the whistleblower's findings. The piece sent shockwaves through the media. For the first time, the public was hearing about the vaccine's dark underbelly, the manipulation of data, the suppression of adverse reactions, and the collusion between pharmaceutical companies and health regulators. The article went viral, and the backlash was immediate. But Phoenix Pharmaceuticals and its allies in the government were ready. They launched a full-scale attack, using their immense resources to discredit Klein and Graves. The pharmaceutical company hired PR firms to spread misinformation and launch personal attacks against the whistleblower. They tried to discredit Klein's journalism, questioning his credibility and accusing him of spreading false information. Despite the smear campaign, the damage had already been done. People began to question the narrative they had been fed for years. The trust in vaccines, once unwavering, began to crumble. The public demanded answers, and the calls for accountability grew louder by the day. The whistleblower, Dr. Eleanor Graves, had set the wheels of a global reckoning in motion. What had begun as a quiet revelation of corporate malpractice was now the focal point of a massive public scandal that threatened to topple the very institutions that had once been trusted to protect public health. As Richard Klein's article circulated through the media, it became clear that the vaccine scandal was far from isolated to the confines of the United States. What had initially been a New York-based investigation soon transformed into a global phenomenon. International media outlets picked up the story, and countries around the world began to see the first waves of outrage. Governments that had proudly endorsed the vaccine now faced the heat of public fury, with citizens questioning how such a disaster could have been allowed to unfold. In the United States, the first major protests began to emerge in major cities. Small grassroots organizations, originally founded to promote vaccine awareness, transformed into full-scale movements demanding justice. People gathered in front of government buildings, holding signs that read, "Justice for the injured" and "Big Pharma lies." The trust that had once been placed in the healthcare system seemed to evaporate overnight. The public outcry wasn't just confined to protesters in the streets. Parents whose children had been harmed by the vaccine began to share their heartbreaking stories. Medical professionals, once part of the mainstream narrative, began questioning their roles in the rollout. Doctors who had once supported the vaccine's safety were now coming forward, admitting that they had been misled by the same pharmaceutical giants that had propagated the myth of its safety. One of the most emotional moments in the scandal came when a group of mothers, whose children had suffered from severe neurological damage after receiving the vaccine, testified before Congress. Their children, once healthy and full of life, were now left with life-altering disabilities. "We trusted you," one mother said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You told us this was for the greater good. You promised it would protect our children. But instead, you destroyed their lives." The political ramifications of the scandal were impossible to ignore. Calls for the resignation of health officials, particularly those at the FDA and CDC, grew louder. Members of Congress, many of whom had been vocal proponents of the vaccine, now found themselves in the hot seat. Some tried to distance themselves from the vaccine's approval, claiming they had been misled, while others sought to deflect the blame onto the pharmaceutical companies. But it wasn't just the US government that was under fire. In the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Canada, similar stories of vaccine-related injuries began to emerge. People who had trusted the vaccine, believing it would protect them from the threat of a global pandemic, now found themselves facing a new crisis, one that was entirely man-made. The global medical community, once united in its advocacy for the vaccine, began to fracture. Former supporters of the vaccine's safety were now calling for independent investigations into its development and distribution. The World Health Organization, which had initially endorsed the vaccine, found itself under scrutiny for its role in pushing the vaccine to market without fully understanding its potential risks. Pharmaceutical companies, including Phoenix Pharmaceuticals, initially refused to accept responsibility. Their defense was simple: the vaccine had passed all the necessary clinical trials, and the side effects were rare and isolated. But as more whistleblowers came forward, former employees, scientists, and health professionals, the evidence became overwhelming. Documents were leaked showing that Phoenix Pharmaceuticals had known about the potential risks of the vaccine for months before it was released. But the company had decided to proceed anyway, convinced that the profits far outweighed the risks. By late 2011, the U.S. Department of Justice had opened an investigation into Phoenix Pharmaceuticals and several other major pharmaceutical companies involved in the vaccine's development. The investigation was seen as a glimmer of hope for those seeking justice, but many were skeptical. Could a system so deeply intertwined with corporate influence and government ties ever truly hold these companies accountable? While the investigations continued, the public's trust in the vaccine and in the healthcare system at large continued to erode. Families who had been harmed by the vaccine faced the difficult challenge of navigating a broken healthcare system that seemed indifferent to their suffering. Lawsuits against Phoenix Pharmaceuticals and the government began to pile up, with victims demanding compensation for their pain and suffering. Despite the mounting legal battles, the pharmaceutical industry remained powerful. Phoenix Pharmaceuticals and other vaccine manufacturers had the financial resources to weather the storm. They hired top lawyers, PR firms, and lobbyists to protect their interests and undermine the growing public backlash. It became clear that the true price of the vaccine scandal would not only be measured in lives lost and damaged, but also in the integrity of public trust. In the midst of this turmoil, a small group of concerned citizens took matters into their own hands. A grassroots movement made up of doctors, scientists, and everyday people who had been personally affected by the scandal began to organize public hearings and investigations. They called for transparency, demanding that the truth about the vaccine's development and approval be revealed in full. They were determined to hold those responsible accountable, even if it meant challenging the very institutions that were supposed to protect the public. But as the investigations continued, one thing became clear: the vaccine scandal was only the tip of the iceberg. The more the public uncovered, the more they realized that the story was far bigger than they had ever imagined. It wasn't just about a single vaccine, it was about a system of corporate greed, governmental negligence, and a hidden agenda that had been running for decades. And as the truth began to come to light, the question on everyone's mind became, what else had they been lied to about? As the vaccine scandal continued to unravel, it became evident that the consequences of the disaster reached far beyond the initial harm caused by the vaccine itself. Whistleblowers and investigative journalists were now unearthing evidence of a much deeper conspiracy, one that had been hidden for years, possibly decades. It wasn't just the vaccine that was at the heart of the scandal. It was a long-running series of government cover-ups, hidden experiments, and unethical collaborations between Big Pharma and regulatory bodies. The more the public learned, the more they realized that what had happened with the vaccine was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger, more troubling pattern of secrecy and corruption. As the government and pharmaceutical companies scrambled to control the narrative, the truth came in drips, slowly revealing the layers of manipulation that had been put in place to deceive the public. One of the most chilling revelations came when several former employees of the FDA and CDC came forward, claiming that they had been part of a covert program to approve and distribute vaccines without proper oversight. These individuals disclosed that there had been multiple instances where potentially dangerous vaccines were pushed through the approval process based on fabricated or manipulated data. According to these whistleblowers, the government agencies responsible for safeguarding public health had been operating under the influence of the pharmaceutical companies for years. Ties between government officials and Big Pharma were more than just financial, they were deeply personal. Many officials had previously worked for the pharmaceutical companies they were now supposed to regulate, and some had even received hefty consulting fees after leaving their positions in government. These individuals, it seemed, had been working on behalf of the companies, not the people. Even more disturbing was the discovery of an ongoing series of secret experiments conducted by pharmaceutical companies under the guise of public health initiatives. Leaked documents revealed that the government had approved, funding for several covert studies in which vulnerable populations, primarily the poor, minorities and children, were subjected to dangerous medical experiments without their knowledge or consent. In one particularly harrowing case, a pharmaceutical company had been conducting human trials on an experimental vaccine in an undisclosed location. The trials, which were supposed to be voluntary, were instead carried out on individuals who had been unknowingly selected from impoverished neighborhoods. These individuals were injected with the experimental vaccine and then monitored for adverse reactions, with no informed consent and no oversight from ethical boards. The documents revealed that these experiments were not only unethical, but were deliberately kept hidden from the public. The data collected from these trials had been falsified to present a favorable outcome, with any adverse effects either ignored or covered up. The families of those who had been subjected to these experiments were never informed, and many of the victims never knew they had been part of a medical trial. As the truth about these experiments came to light, public outrage reached new heights. People were horrified by the extent to which the government and pharmaceutical companies had gone to exploit vulnerable populations for profit. Families who had already suffered the devastating effects of the vaccine now realized that they had been subjected to dangerous experiments as part of a larger conspiracy, a conspiracy that stretched across borders, political lines, and decades of deceit. At the same time, a growing number of people began to question the very foundation of the medical system they had trusted for so long. How could they have been so blind? How could they have believed that the government and the pharmaceutical companies were looking out for their best interests? What other secrets were being kept from them? The conspiracy had now taken on a life of its own, with increasingly bold accusations about government cover-ups, secret societies, and the manipulation of public health for financial gain. But the deeper the investigation went, the more dangerous it became. Investigative journalists, whistleblowers, and activists began to face increasing threats. People who had once been at the forefront of the investigation now found themselves on the receiving end of smear campaigns, legal threats, and in some cases, even violence. The growing pressure caused many to go into hiding, and several key figures in the investigation were forced to disappear from the public eye. Some activists were targeted by shadowy groups with links to the pharmaceutical industry, while others received anonymous threats warning them to stop digging into the past. But despite the mounting pressure, the revelations kept coming. Each new piece of information uncovered only deepened the mystery and fueled the growing public outcry. It was clear that the conspiracy went far beyond a single vaccine or a single company. It was part of a much larger web of deceit that had been spun over decades, with the lives of millions of people caught in the balance. As the investigations gained momentum, a new theory began to emerge. The idea that the vaccine scandal was just one of many covert operations being carried out by powerful factions within the government and pharmaceutical industry. Was there a hidden agenda behind the vaccine rollout? Was it possible that the public had been deliberately manipulated for years, their trust used as a tool for control? The idea of a shadowy alliance between pharmaceutical companies, government agencies, and powerful secret societies began to gain traction, particularly among those who had been directly impacted by the vaccine. Theories about mind control experiments, time manipulation, and even alien encounters started to emerge. Whether these theories were founded in fact or fueled by paranoia, they spoke to the underlying truth that something far more sinister was at play. The investigations continued, and the public remained on edge, wondering just how deep the conspiracy went and what the ultimate consequences would be. As the global outcry continued to gain momentum, the government's response to the vaccine scandal grew increasingly defensive. Those in power, from public health officials to elected politicians, began to shift the narrative, downplaying the seriousness of the accusations and framing the issue as a matter of isolated incidents rather than systemic corruption. The pharmaceutical companies, too, remained steadfast in their denial, with Phoenix Pharmaceuticals doubling down on its stance that the vaccine had passed all necessary safety protocols and was, in fact, a crucial part of global health initiatives. The strategy was simple: ignore the public's demands for accountability and focus on reinforcing the official narrative. But the people were no longer willing to accept the government's assurances. The scandal had shaken the very foundation of trust that had existed between the public and their leaders. The media, for its part, had begun to shift its tone. Initially, the mainstream outlets had been reluctant to cover the issue in depth, often framing the controversy as a fringe concern. However, as the investigations continued and more whistleblowers came forward, the story was too large to ignore. The public was demanding answers, and journalists began to push for more transparency. Yet many outlets still found themselves treading lightly, wary of the powerful interests that would come after them if they dug too deeply. In Washington, politicians who had once publicly endorsed the vaccine began to distance themselves from the scandal. Some tried to deflect blame, claiming they had relied on the expertise of health agencies and were unaware of the falsified data. Others attempted to shift the focus to other issues, hoping that the public's attention would move away from the vaccine scandal. But it was clear that the damage had already been done. People no longer believed the words of their leaders. Meanwhile, grassroots activists and legal teams began to organize a coordinated effort to hold those responsible accountable. Lawsuits were filed against both Phoenix Pharmaceuticals and the government, demanding compensation for the victims of the vaccine. These lawsuits not only targeted the companies, but also named government officials who had played a role in the approval process, including key figures at the CDC and FDA. In one of the most notable cases, a group of parents whose children had been severely affected by the vaccine filed a class action lawsuit against the government and Phoenix Pharmaceuticals, demanding that they be held accountable for the widespread harm caused by the vaccine. The case gained national attention and was seen as a pivotal moment in the fight for justice. The government's response to the lawsuits was typically evasive. They argued that the vaccine's approval had been in line with standard procedures and that the adverse reactions were, at best, rare and unpreventable. They claimed that the public health benefits of the vaccine far outweighed the risks. But as the evidence against them mounted, it became increasingly difficult for them to maintain this position. Documents showing collusion between the government and pharmaceutical companies continued to surface, leading to calls for an independent, impartial investigation into the entire approval process. But the government was not about to go down without a fight. They hired high-powered law firms to defend the vaccine's safety, and officials took to the airwaves, attempting to reassure the public that the vaccine was still a necessary and vital part of global health efforts. Some even tried to shift the blame to the individuals who had been affected, suggesting that their reactions were either exaggerated or due to pre-existing conditions. Despite the government's efforts to downplay the scandal, the public was beginning to demand a much broader reckoning. The issues surrounding the vaccine were not just about one incident of corporate negligence. They were about a much larger pattern of abuse and manipulation by pharmaceutical companies and government agencies alike. People began to ask, how many other vaccines, treatments, and medications had been rushed to market without proper scrutiny? What other corporate interests were being prioritized over public safety? The scope of the scandal was now impossible to ignore. The government, despite its denials, was facing mounting pressure to answer for the role it had played in allowing the vaccine to be released under such questionable circumstances. But the fight for justice was far from over. The pharmaceutical companies, with their vast resources and political influence, were not about to let themselves be held accountable without a fight. In the months that followed, investigations into the pharmaceutical industry grew more widespread. It wasn't just Phoenix Pharmaceuticals that was under scrutiny, it was the entire industry. A growing number of whistleblowers came forward, revealing details about the ways in which companies manipulated data, concealed risks, and colluded with government agencies to maximize their profits at the expense of public health. It became clear that this scandal was part of a much larger pattern of corporate behavior that spanned multiple industries and decades. But despite the mounting evidence, the fight for justice remained an uphill battle. The pharmaceutical industry's power and influence were formidable, and the government's ability to suppress information and protect corporate interests remained strong. Many of the victims who had been harmed by the vaccine found themselves facing not only the physical consequences of their injuries, but also the emotional and financial toll of a long and arduous fight for compensation and accountability. As the legal battles dragged on, the public's frustration grew. The question remained, would those responsible for the vaccine scandal ever be held accountable, or would they continue to hide behind their wealth and power? As the investigations into the vaccine scandal gained momentum, the public's disillusionment with both the pharmaceutical companies and the government reached a boiling point. The official narrative, perpetuated by mainstream media and government spokespeople, seemed more and more like an attempt to downplay the severity of the situation. While the media outlets continued to repeat the message that the vaccine was still necessary for public health, a significant portion of the population began to question everything they had been told. For many, the vaccine scandal was no longer just about a single faulty product. It had become a symbol of a larger problem. People began to connect the dots between corporate greed, government corruption, and the manipulation of public health initiatives. A new narrative was emerging, one that not only challenged the vaccine's safety, but also cast a dark shadow on the entire medical and political system. Conspiracy theories, often dismissed as baseless, began to proliferate in social media circles and on underground forums. What had once been whispers of hidden agendas and corporate collusion now gained traction as more and more people began to piece together their own versions of the story. The idea that the vaccine scandal was part of a global conspiracy, orchestrated by powerful elites and secret societies, resonated with people who felt betrayed by the institutions they had trusted their entire lives. One of the most pervasive theories was that the vaccine had been intentionally released not just to profit pharmaceutical companies, but to further a much more insidious agenda. Some believed that the vaccine was part of a larger, covert operation to control the population, perhaps even to weaken the immune systems of millions in order to make them more susceptible to future illnesses or to prepare for a global population reduction. These theories, though often speculative, found a receptive audience among those who had lost faith in the government and media. The idea of mind control experiments tied to the vaccine became one of the most discussed conspiracy theories. Proponents of this theory argued that the adverse effects of the vaccine were not accidental, but were designed to alter the behavior and cognition of individuals in ways that could be controlled. This, they believed, was part of a long-standing program to manipulate the minds of the global population under the guise of public health initiatives. In parallel, the theory of time manipulation emerged, fueled by the increasing suspicion that something more than just corporate greed was at play. Some conspiracy theorists suggested that the vaccine was linked to secret experiments in time travel or temporal manipulation. They pointed to the vaccine's rushed development and the mysterious deaths of prominent figures involved in the research as evidence that the scandal was tied to a much deeper and more dangerous program. Despite the highly speculative nature of many of these theories, the conspiracy narrative was gaining ground. People who were already skeptical of the government's explanation began to embrace these alternative ideas, looking for answers that aligned with their own growing sense of distrust. The mainstream media's refusal to report on the hidden aspects of the vaccine's development only further fueled the belief that there was a concerted effort to hide the truth. The alternative narrative was also being shaped by lost civilizations theories. Some of the more extreme conspiracists connected the scandal to the idea that ancient, advanced civilizations had developed knowledge of vaccines and medical practices far ahead of their time, and that this knowledge was being suppressed. These theorists argued that the government and pharmaceutical companies were trying to recreate these ancient technologies in secret, manipulating the public into accepting treatments that were both dangerous and part of a larger, more cryptic plan. As the alternative narratives gained traction, they began to intersect with other global issues, including the rise of populist movements and distrust in mainstream institutions. People who had once believed in the benevolence of the government, the safety of vaccines, and the integrity of the medical community now found themselves questioning every aspect of their lives. What else had they been lied to about? What other agendas were at play in their health, education, and even their personal freedom? For many, the vaccine scandal was no longer just a public health issue. It had become a fundamental crisis of trust. The increasing influence of conspiracy theories led to the formation of underground groups, social media movements, and even independent investigations that sought to expose the truth behind the scandal. These groups, often ignored or ridiculed by the mainstream media, began to grow in influence as more people turned to alternative sources of information to fill the void left by the government's lack of transparency. The backlash against the official narrative reached a peak when high-profile whistleblowers, individuals with credible ties to government, agencies, and the pharmaceutical industry, began to speak out publicly about the extent of the cover-up. Their accounts, though often difficult to verify, were seen by many as the final pieces of evidence that the global public health crisis was not an accident, but rather the culmination of years of systematic manipulation. As the public's anger and suspicion grew, the pressure on the government and pharmaceutical companies became unbearable. Investigations deepened, and while some officials were forced to resign, the most powerful figures managed to maintain their grip on power. The legal battles continued, but the damage to the public trust was already done. The more the conspiracy theories were discussed, the more the lines between fact and fiction began to blur. Was there truly a hidden agenda behind the vaccine? Or were these just the fevered imaginings of a public desperate for answers? The search for the truth was no longer just about a vaccine. It was about unraveling the very fabric of the system that had failed the public so profoundly. And as the scandal continued to unfold, one question remained at the heart of the storm. How much longer could the truth stay hidden? As the dust began to settle from the whirlwind of revelations, the world was left to confront the consequences of the vaccine scandal. The official narrative had collapsed, but the damage caused by years of deception, corporate greed, and government negligence was far from over. The fight for accountability was just beginning, and it was clear that the vaccine scandal was not a single moment in time. It was a rupture in the global trust that would take decades to heal, if it ever could. The lawsuits continued to pile up. Thousands of individuals and families who had been harmed by the vaccine sought compensation for the pain, suffering, and irreversible damage they had endured. But the legal battles were long and exhausting. The pharmaceutical companies, with their vast resources, fought back with everything they had: expensive legal teams, public relations campaigns, and lobbying efforts that stretched into the highest levels of government. The courts were flooded with cases, but the victims struggled to get the justice they deserved. Many found themselves facing an uphill battle, as the pharmaceutical companies used every legal maneuver to delay or dismiss the cases. Meanwhile, the government, under pressure from both the public and international bodies, was forced to launch its own investigations. But these investigations, despite being touted as independent, were largely seen as superficial and incomplete. The government's role in the scandal was too intertwined with the interests of the pharmaceutical companies to allow for a truly impartial investigation. The public had lost faith in the very institutions that were meant to protect them, and the investigations felt like little more than an attempt to save face. As the years passed, the vaccine scandal became a permanent fixture in global discourse. The effects of the vaccine, both physical and psychological, were still being felt by millions around the world. Survivors of the adverse reactions continued to struggle with lifelong health issues, while the families of those who had died remained haunted by their losses. But beyond the individual suffering, the scandal had sparked a wider conversation about the integrity of the medical system. the influence of pharmaceutical companies, and the power of government regulators. Trust in public health had been irreparably damaged, and many began to wonder how much of what they had been told about medicine, vaccines, and public health had been manipulated for corporate gain. In the years following the scandal, conspiracy theories continued to proliferate. The narrative of government cover-ups, pharmaceutical manipulation, and shadowy corporate interests gained a foothold in the global psyche. For many, the idea that the vaccine was part of a larger plan for control, manipulation, and population management became a deeply ingrained belief. The vaccine scandal had opened a Pandora's box, and the theories about what lay inside were as varied and wild as the people who subscribed to them. But even as the conspiracy theories took hold, there were those who continued to fight for the truth. Independent journalists, whistleblowers, and activists remained determined to expose the full extent of the scandal. They worked tirelessly to document the evidence, to bring forward new whistleblowers, and to keep the conversation alive. They knew that the fight for accountability was far from over, and that the vaccine scandal was just one chapter in a much larger story about corruption, corporate greed, and the failure of the institutions that were supposed to protect the public. In the face of this ongoing struggle, one thing became clear. The vaccine scandal was not just about one product or one incident. It was about the systemic problems that allowed corporate interests to override public health, about the dangers of unchecked power, and about the importance of transparency and accountability in the medical and governmental systems. As the years passed, the lessons of the vaccine scandal remained etched in the collective memory of the public. People had been betrayed, and they would not soon forget. The lasting impact of the vaccine scandal was also felt in the political arena. Politicians, especially those who had been complicit in supporting the vaccine rollout, now found themselves facing a new wave of skepticism from the public. Populist movements that had gained traction in the wake of the scandal began to rise, calling for an overhaul of the political system and a reevaluation of the power held by pharmaceutical companies. The scandal had shifted the political landscape, and it had done so in a way that would have lasting consequences for years to come. At the same time, the pharmaceutical industry was forced to confront the reality of the public's distrust. Phoenix Pharmaceuticals, along with other companies implicated in the scandal, faced increased scrutiny from regulators, journalists, and the public. The pharmaceutical giant made efforts to rebuild its reputation, but the damage had already been done. The public no longer trusted the company, and its financial future became uncertain. While some corporations and politicians were able to weather the storm, others were left reeling. The fight for justice and accountability continued, but it was clear that the vaccine scandal had left a permanent scar on society. In the end, the scandal was not just a cautionary tale about corporate malpractice. It was a reminder of the power of transparency, the importance of public trust, and the need for vigilance in the face of those who would prioritize profit over human lives. The echoes of the vaccine scandal would continue to reverberate long after the headlines had faded. In the years that followed, the world watched as trust in medical institutions, pharmaceutical companies, and government agencies eroded to unprecedented levels. What had begun as a seemingly isolated incident had sparked a global awakening, one that would forever alter the way the public viewed the intersection of healthcare and corporate power. The victims of the vaccine, their stories of suffering and betrayal, became symbols of the deep flaws within a system that had once been trusted to safeguard their well-being. Families who had lost loved ones continued to search for justice, their voices a constant reminder of the price paid for unchecked greed and neglect. Though the legal battles dragged on, the damage was already done. The public was no longer willing to accept the status quo. The question remained, how could a system that had failed so many ever be trusted again? For some, the fight for accountability never ended. Whistleblowers and activists, often working in the shadows, kept the pressure on. They knew that the truth, though buried beneath layers of deceit and power, would eventually come to light. But the scars left by the scandal were deep, and the trust that had been shattered was not easily repaired. As the years passed, the vaccine scandal became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of blind trust, the importance of transparency, and the need for a healthcare system that truly prioritized people over profit. The story may have faded from the headlines, but its lessons would linger long into the future.